Hey guys, Luke here from Flukes Kitesurfing. Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to go through how I like to build my strapless kiteboards. So this is a small wave strapless freestyle kiteboard. I use the same processes for building all of my boards, including my surfboards. And we're going to go start to finish on building the blank, shaping, glassing, sanding, all the way to riding this board. In the last video we covered the design and planning of it, so you can go and check out that video, and you can also download the plans if you like for this exact board. This is the actual board that we make in this video. And of course I've been riding it now for about a month or so. It's been going really well, and you know, I really enjoy it. It's that sort of small wave freestyle crossover board that I'm using for when the surf's small, so I want to do some jumps but I might want to do some turns as well. And I've been riding this up at the lake now for the last month or so and having a really good time on it. So, and it's still in one piece, so success. So like I said, this video we're going to start to finish on how I like to make them, so let's get into it. So to start with, I go and get some red cedar. You could use different timbers, anything that works for surfboard building, but I like to use red cedar for my stringer, and I just rip it down to an oversized piece. Rip it up and then dress it up, making sure it's nice and flat. You could actually substitute this for maybe some plywood or something like that, but like I said, in this case I just like to machine up some red cedar. I also like to machine up two pieces, and you'll see that this helps a lot with the hot wire cutter. So then the next step is to mark the rocker profile on the what are the cedar stringers, and again you want to make this oversized because we want to leave enough space so that we can still shape the board, but not so much space that you're going to have to plane and overwork the foam. It takes forever. And so I start by just drawing the rocker profile on the board itself, and then I join both pieces together and then cut them out together so that you've basically got two strings. So you could be using just another piece of ply as a template here, but I just make a second stringer for a different board in the future. And with both of these pieces, you just put a mark on it, make sure that you're going to keep it aligned, and then I just literally screw this into a foam block, making sure that they're perfectly aligned from side to side. And this is enough. With this density foam, this is enough to hold this in place for the hot wire cutter, but you might need to clamp this or find another way to support it, or you might have different foam, you know, so you'd have to just think about how to align your two stringers to run the hot wire cutter. But once that's fastened in place, then I just use my homemade hot wire cutter. There's a video on YouTube that I've posted for how I made this hot wire cutter, so you can go and check that out if you don't have one. And then you just rest that gently on the two stringers from side to side, and just working from both ends, just slowly cut through the foam. And this, like I said, will give us that slightly oversized foam blank. The hot wire cutter works really well for this purpose. You could use skinnier pieces of foam and then join them together like I did with my mid-length hydrofoil board, so you can check those videos out if you want to see a different way to make a blank using foam. But in this case I've got the big blocks, so this is the way I'm doing it. Plus the blocks are wide enough, they're 300 wide each, so with a stringer in the middle it gives you enough to basically make most boards, which is about 24 inches or 600 millimeters wide total. So now that I've got my foam pieces cut out, I can put the stringer in the middle, and I'm using a couple of bar clamps just to pin this in place while the resin dries. You could use straps or another way just to weight it down and join these two pieces together, but bar clamps are great with a board this size because it's so small. And then just using the same epoxy resin system that we use for the fiberglass layup, I'm just mixing that up, painting it onto the foam, painting it onto the cedar stringer on both sides of each one, so that you're getting a good layer of resin, but you don't want to oversaturate into the foam. You're not trying to make it heavy, but you want this to stick. And then you can just put them together perfectly lined up. You don't want them to be misaligned because you'll end up with a skewed blank, and that's another good reason for the bar clamps in this case. It keeps it really sitting flat on the bottom, and then just moderate pressure there with the bar clamps just to make sure we're getting a bit of squeeze out with the resin, and it holds it in place while it sets up. Now we can basically put them aside and let that dry, and I'll start making my outline template. I do this with all of my boards. Take some pieces of white cardboard, tape them together, and just create a nice flat surface in order to draw our outline template. The outline template you can draw for yourself. You can also go and grab the plans that we have, download them from the website and see exactly the dimensions that I'm using for this. but you could just go and find a board that you like online, or maybe you've got a board at home that you want to replicate. So you can basically go and plot all of the dimensions that you need in order to transfer that onto a piece of cardboard, and then if you want to change some dimensions, you can, and then you will use this half template to lay on the blank. So I start by just drawing the stringer, so a straight line straight down the board, straight down the cardboard, that is what is the stringer and the center mark of the board, and then I measure out for the nose and the tail, and then from the nose and the tail I plot in 1 inch, 3 inch, 6 inch, 12 inch and 24 inches, and the center mark and the widest point. So you'll see all of that marked on the plans from our website. And by doing that, we can then square off the stringer and create all of our sort of perpendicular lines, which we can then measure out from the stringer to the dimension that we have. So again, you could do this on your own computer. You can see my laptop in the background there where I've drawn this up, and then you measure out to all of those points as a reference, and then you can just transfer all of those dimensions onto the cardboard. So it's a great way to be able to plot out any design of any board. I do it with all of my boards that I make ever. This is how I like to do it. And then it's just a matter of connecting the dots. So holding something flexible, this is a lot easier with a second person, but I'm just using a heavy box of screws there to support the ruler while I start tracing around these corners. And then it's just a simple matter of cutting that out neatly with a pair of scissors, and we're ready to transfer it over to the blank. Again, with the scissors, we really want to make sure this is a really nice, neat, clean, straight cut, that everything is blended, because this line, when we transfer it onto the blank, that's all we have to work from. Okay, so now the blank's all glued up and that's looking good. Good adhesion there, everything's stuck together, so we're ready to start shaping. Okay, so next I take it into the shaping bay, and first step with the electric planer is just to clean up the blank. Any highs, any bumps and lumps, anything that's sort of obvious that's going to take away from us being able to run nice clean lengths with the electric planer. So just knock all those off, and then I just take a couple of swipes just to clean it up enough that it will be able to draw a nice clean line for the outline template. So just sort of cleaning up the bottom of the blank. I like to mark my blank on the bottom side of the board, and so I find it's a lot easier to plane it smooth like we've just done. So that's why I have it this way first. Then we just roll out and lay the outline template on. Of course, we'll be marking exactly in the center of the stringer with our template, and then flipping it over so that we have a perfectly symmetrical board on both sides. So just weigh that down, and then with a nice soft pencil, just carefully mark out this line. We're going to cut exactly to this line and sand exactly to this line, and so this needs to be perfect. So once you're happy with both sides and it's all marked out, the next step is to just eye it up and make sure you're happy with the shape. So I like to just have a look at it, roll my eye along it, make sure that there's no weird lumps or anything, stand it up, stand back, look at the shape, make sure you're happy, because this is the time to change it if you want to. Then just using a handsaw, I start by cutting it to length. So right on the nose and the tail, I cut exactly to the line so that you don't have to make too many adjustments to the stringer while we're shaping. And then I just go around the outline, leaving about 3 millimeters from the line all the way around. So I use this sort of overhand grip there so that you can eye up the saw and make sure that it's perfectly square to the blank. If you're cutting on a slope right now, that can cause a lot of problems, particularly if you're undercutting on the bottom side, so that the board's actually smaller on the underside. So really important to keep it nice and square while you're cutting. And then I just clean up a little bit around the nose and tail. It doesn't need to be perfect. We're going to clean this up with the surf form now. So then I just take a surf form and I start blending that all the way around the rails. This is a really rough tool. It tears out a lot of the EPS particularly, and it's really just a matter of cleaning it up. And then you can use your square, a builder square, or your eye, just making sure that you're keeping it really square to the bottom side of the board there, because again, we don't want to take too much off the bottom. Then I moved to my sanding block. This is just a block of wood with a belt sanding, a 60 grit belt sanding pad glued onto it, and I find this really helpful in smoothing out any imperfections. Plus it's wide enough to rub over the entire bottom side of the blank, or the entire width of the blank. So I use this a lot. And just going around making sure the outline is perfect. The goal here is to make sure the outline is completed. We actually don't touch one part of the outline ever again, and so this needs to be the perfect line, exactly how you want the board to finish at this point, because like I said, you don't come back and correct this at all. So going round and round, making sure the tail's good, the nose is good, rolling it with my eye, making sure that there's no lumps or bumps or indentations or anything like that. Once we've done that, it's time to flatten out the blank. And what I mean by flattening out is actually removing any twists. Because we're building the blank ourselves, of course there can be a lot of problems with the blank. So the first step is just to make sure that it's flat from end to end. So I go the lengthways with the electric planer, with the planer just held straight, and just sort of clean it all up as best I can. And then I move to getting a couple of straight edges. And if you sit the straight edges in different areas of the board, when you sight them, they should be exactly parallel. So if you see one sort of sitting down and on one end, or if they're sort of sitting on angles, then you know you've got a twist in the blank. So I just go and then I just look for where maybe there was a high spot or anything, and I just clean that up. In this case, a little on that side of the board, so just a few swipes over there to make sure that that side is the same plane as the other side. Then I move back to the surf form now and just start flattening it all out, just very briefly now, just enough that I can start to measure for my rocker design. So the rocker design is marked out on the plan, so you can see the exact rocker design that I'm using, but generally speaking it's about 2 inches in the tail and about 4 inches in the nose for a board this length. And so what I do is I take a straight edge that has the center of it marked perfectly, and then I mark the center of the board so that the straight edge, center, and the center of the board are perfect, and the board's kind of level at that point. And then I measure down 4 inches in the nose, 2 inches in the tail, and that will vary based on your rocker design, of course. And then we can come back from the nose and plot some points. In this case, I'm looking at the 1 inch, 3 inch, 12 inch, and 24 inch, and measure down from that straight edge, and that gives us the curve of our rocker. And so we start just by machining it close. So I just grab the planer and I just take sort of the majority of the bulk out, and then you can come back and keep checking with that straight edge until you're happy that all of those plotted points are perfect. It's basically just a way to keep track of the curve, make sure you're not too steep of a curve or too flattening out or whatever. So you basically can work from the plans, or you can measure a different board that you like, or you can draw your own rocker design, but this is how I like to do it. I also just sight the board to make sure it looks good as well. Very important in board building to make sure things feel and look good. It's not all about your dimensions. Sometimes it's about having really nice flow, no kinks, no lumps, things like that. So now that I've taken most of the bulk out, I mark the center again, and then plot my points again, and then measure up again, and just see, do I need to take more off the very end of the nose or more towards the center of the board, things like that, and then we can just clean that up again. So once you're happy, then I just take my sanding block and really start working all the way across the board to flatten it. So if I've taken a little too much on one side or the other side, then this is a great time just to flatten it all out. Just with a block plane or a spoke shave, you're taking down the stringer as you're working. This is another good time just to sight it, make sure it's still in the right plane. You can see in this case I've got a bit of a lump right there in that nose section, so just working that down and getting this bottom of the board nice and flat and the rocker design perfect. So the curvature of that board plays such a big role in the performance of a board, so it's worth spending a little bit of time here and making sure that the underside of the board is perfect, because that is of course what is in contact with the water. So then once I've done that, I move to my thickness. So the thickness is done by measuring up from the bottom to the deck of the board. So first I just flip it over and with the electric planer knock off all those highs again from the imperfection from the hot wire cutter. And then I go to the center of the board and I measure up from the bottom the thickness, in this case 50 millimeters. And I just draw a line on both sides so I know the reference point as I'm taking the thickness out to make sure it's parallel on both sides, and then I measure from the stringer to make sure that my board is symmetrical at this stage as well. Then with the planer on an angle, on a 45-degree angle, you can start to work down the board, because as it goes up into the curve of the nose, it can be a little hard to get the planer in there. So you can see I've got the planer straight as I'm taking the back, from the tail to about 3/4 of the board. But then when I'm doing the nose, I hold the planer on about a 45-degree angle to really work it down into that curve. If you had a specific planer for this, you can probably do the entire run in one go. But what I like to do is I just work the nose down a little bit, and then I go back and I work the deck down, and just making sure I'm taking a similar amount all of the time. Sometimes really counting my strokes on either side. So if I take 3 strokes with the planer on one side, then I move to the other side and I take the same amount on the other side, so that I know that I am sort of methodically taking this down. And even though it might look a little random what I'm doing, I'm very much counting what I'm doing and trying to make sure that everything's coming off evenly, so you don't end up with weird lumps that you have to fix later. Then to get into the nose, I really find I have to go to the spoke shave and the surf form. Can't quite finish it with the planer because it sort of gouges out a lot when you're doing that curve. And so I leave a bit of material in there to finish by hand, and I just hit it with the spoke shave and the surf form and get that curve nice and smooth. You want to make sure that that blends really well into the deck, so you're not taking a divot just before it curves up for the nose. You could sort of take too much or not enough, and so again, you're really trying to get a nice smooth line that is going along the deck of that rocker design. And again, that's explained in the planning and overview video on how that actually looks. So once it's getting close, just checking to make sure I've got the right thickness, and then I'll just roll it over and take the very last part of the rocker out of the nose. So right at the nose there, just turn that very last sort of 20 millimeters up. So I just sort of don't want to take too much until I've done the deck as well. So this is kind of a finishing step, just to really roll that very last bit up. And then with the same sanding block, just again cleaning this up. This is more about shaping than it is about sanding at this stage, because we're going to do all of the rail bands and stuff in a moment. So just flattening it all off, getting those major marks that we've just put into it with the planer out, and just cleaning it up. This is how it looks finished. So everything's looking well blended, nice and smooth. You can sort of see now with the hard edges from the rail to the deck and to the bottom, as you roll your eye along those corners, you can see if there's any lumps or imperfections. So lots of checking at this point, checking your measurements. We've got our thickness right, and that should be parallel all the way through the thickness of the board there to our line on the other side as well. It blends up to the tail. You can see I've just left a little bit out of the tail rocker still at this stage, but that's because I sort of looked at the tail rocker and I thought that's exactly where I wanted it to be. And right up to leaving around about 5 millimeters in the nose there that we'll just round over. So the next step is rail bands. So the rail bands I do a little bit differently to a lot of people, where I just mark some parallel lines off the stringer. And so what we're looking at here is a 50 millimeter, 100 millimeter, 150 millimeter parallel line from the stringer, so that it's actually 50 millimeters from the center of the rail is how I get that first line. And I just draw these straight lines to serve as reference guides for while I'm turning over the rails. All you're really trying to do is create a bit of a grid so that you can see what you're doing while you're planing. So you can check from side to side and make sure you're doing the same thing on either side of the board. So these straight lines just sort of serve as that reference for me. Then I take a pencil gauge that intersects with that line closest to the rail, and I just go around with a parallel curve as well. So now I've got a parallel curve. It's around about 50 millimeters from the inside of the rail, and I've got the straight lines. Then I mark in the center of the rail, and I set the pencil gauge to that, and off the bottom side of the board, draw that curved line as well. And this will serve as a parallel line off the bottom side of the board, really important line. Then I do the same thing off the other side and off the deck. So that might seem like a lot of information there, but what I'm doing is you can see here, I'm creating this sort of grid pattern. So straight lines along where the stringer is, then a parallel line on the rail, and then a parallel line from the bottom of the board, and a parallel line from the top of the board. All I'm really doing there is, like I said, just serving something as a guide so I can see what I'm working on. You could do this differently if you want. So now that I've got my lines, I just set the planer nice and deep to about 3 millimeters, and on the corner of it, you're matching the line on the center of the rail that we've just drawn with the first line on the deck of the board, and just creating an angle that's going to intersect with both of those lines. So the angle is set by that first line on the deck and the halfway point on the rail, and I just keep swiping that down until it gets close. You're going to be taking more out of the center of the board here and feathering out towards the nose and the tail. You can see how the planer is sort of taking less towards the nose as it gets thinner, and I'm getting pretty close here where I've taken that line, you know, I'm about 5 millimeters off the line on the bottom and almost hitting the line on the deck. You don't want to go past that line because we still need to roll it over, but for this board, which is about a 60-40 or even 70-30, where we're taking more curvature out of the deck of the board and less on the underside of the board, I do plane all the way to that line. So I'm just taking that down to the line now, so we're exactly perfectly touching the line on the deck and the center of the rail. So now you can see I've taken it right down to the line. It's touching that parallel line that we did on the deck now, so it's sort of wrapping around, and it's sort of following the parallel line that we marked off the bottom of the board, if you will. So it just serves as a good way of leaving that 25 millimeter parallel off the underside of the board all the way around, and it's starting to blend out into the tail there almost to nothing, and same at the nose. And then the next step is to start to blend onto the deck. So this angle is halfway in between the angle that we just planed and the flat surface of the deck of the board. So just taking sort of the next angle, if you will, that will ultimately form a curve. So a few swipes on either side, counting those swipes again, making sure that I'm taking the same amount off each side, working into the nose there a little bit, and you can see that's starting to flatten out. And I've gone to the next line. Then once I'm happy with that, I'll take the next angle, which is half of the angle that we just planed plus half of the deck, and that will get very close to sort of creating a curve. And then I just start to turn it down. So start blending it down and using the surf form, which removes a lot of this EPS really quickly. So it's easy to start turning this into a nice sort of smooth surface. The amount of material that you take out is up to the design of the board that you want, but for most of my boards, I like to have, you can see I've sort of left that flat section all the way through the deck around about 50 to 70 millimeters from the stringer, and then it rolls down and it's almost like a parallel line that's running down the stringer there, and by keeping that parallel as the board curves, that's what creates the blending out of that angle. So now that we've roughed out the rail bands, it's time to flip it over and do the concave design. So I just pencil mark that out and get it close, and then with the planer I'm taking some of the material out of the center of the board so that essentially it flattens out the rocker right under your front foot, and this will allow for easier planing of the board. It doesn't have as much of a curve when the board is flat on the water. This is my favorite rocker profile. I do a single in the center of the board and then through to a double in the tail. So with the planer, I just sort of swipe it through onto either side, but not touching the stringer as we're going out into the tail. And I find that just a couple of swipes with the planer there into the tail are enough. And then I move to hand with the surf form again, because otherwise the planer can really gouge that out. And so on the rails now, you can sort of see that we've got that parallel line left, it's blending out into the tail, it's blending out into the nose, and we're almost perfectly parallel with that 25 millimeter or half the rail length, width, all the way around on the edges. So now it's a matter of just blending that all together and getting a nice smooth curve. Hit all those highs off and smooth everything out. An area to pay attention to is right here in the nose, where it's easy to leave a bit too much bulk there. So I find that you sort of want to really slim that out and get that nice and slender coming up into the nose. That's an area that new board builders often leave too much material. And then you're just trying to smooth that curve off so it feels and looks good at this point. the shaping's kind of done. So with the concave, again, just knocking most of the material out with the surf form, but not all the way to the rail. So the concave design stays a little bit off the rail, and then I work from the center of the board out through the tail on either side of the stringer, and not touching the stringer in the tail at all. So you can imagine these lines going from the center of the board out on either corner of the tail and not actually through the center of the tail. Then I also find that I really need to sand right up into the nose there. Make sure you haven't got a kink that goes from the nose into the concave, and then just using the sandpaper, just swiping out on that angle that's going over each side of the tail. And then I just keep sanding that so it's all smooth. We don't want any kinks or hard edges again. And then same deal on the deck of the board, just smoothing it all out with the sander now. But you might have noticed that I haven't actually rolled over the edge of the rail itself. So at this point we leave that hard edge all the way around, and what that means is it's very easy to get a guide on how much material you've taken off on each side. If you actually curve over the rail at this point, then you can't really tell what you're still working on. So I leave that hard edge all the way around while I'm sanding it so that I can see how much thickness I've been taking off on each side. But at this point, I'm really sanding this down now so that we're removing a lot of the imperfections, making sure we don't have any lumps or any chips and things like that, smoothing everything out, because this is getting close to the finished sanding job that we'll be using for our glassing. You know, I've seen a bit of a lump here. We don't want, you know, something plowing the water, imagine. So you want that smooth flow of water. So just making sure everything's really smooth here. That's all part of the fun of hand shaping and getting it all looking and feeling good. So I sand right down to that edge, making sure that I'm really happy that all of those rails are symmetrical from side to side. Everything's neat, everything's even. But again, we still haven't quite turned over the rail yet. See, we've got that really nice sharp line all the way around now, but the whole board is starting to look very smooth and no real lumps or anything. And then the concave, we run our concave shape pretty finished now as well, so you can see right through the center of the mid section of the board, right into that lump in the tail there. So you've got that double concave through the tail. And with the straight edge on it, it's a little easier to see. Around about 4 or 5 millimeters of concave in the center. And then about 2 to 3 millimeters in the center of the tail on either side. And that creates naturally a V in the absolute tail. So once I'm happy that everything is sanded smooth, it's time to knock over the corner of that rail. So holding it on sort of a 45-degree angle with the surf form, I just go around and just start smooth, like just taking the corner off of the rail on the deck and on the bottom side, but not into the tail yet. So we want to leave that hard edge for the water release in the tail. So I just sort of knock over most of it, and then I leave that hard edge for a moment. And then using the sandpaper, I'm just rolling my wrist on bringing it up to the surface of the deck of the board and around to the rail of the board, but never actually hitting the absolute rail, because the rail shape we don't want to change at this point, just trying to smooth it out. So we already know our rail shape's perfect, our outline shape, and so you just want to sort of blend the sandpaper down without taking it onto the rail itself. So then with the tail, what you want to do is hold the sandpaper on about a 10 to 15 degree angle, but not roll it over. So we're not trying to make it soft, but we're trying to keep it so that the tail of the board actually has a bit of a roll, but we keep a hard edge right on the tail's edge. So I'll show you a close up in a moment. But what that does is it allows us to roll the fiberglass cloth around the tail. So you don't want to leave the tail of the board a dead sharp 90-degree corner. You want to sort of curve it around slightly so the cloth will wrap, and then we build our hard edge with some resin. So once I'm happy that I've rolled over those rails with the coarse sandpaper, what I've got here is a bit of drywall sandpaper or gyprock sandpaper or a screen, and it's on a pad that has foam backing. So it's sort of a softer sanding pad, so it just smooths out any of those lumps, and I just go all the way around it. This is 120 grit at this point, so this does a great job of just smoothing everything out, ready for fiberglass. So it's important now to go around and round with the 120 grit sandpaper, the planer, the spoke shave, and just go round and round and round and make sure your shape's perfect, because you can't sand any lumps or make any changes once we fiberglass. And then once I'm happy with that, I move to another soft block as well with some 240 grit sandpaper. This is the finished sanding grit. So I just go round and round and round again, smoothing everything off and really working on the rails as well now. So using a flexible pad, just smoothing everything out so it feels good. Again, taking any of those highs off. We want to roll over the rail itself. This is using that screen. This is a great way just to hit any of those highs, and you'll see those slight ridges when you're sanding it for yourself, if there's any ridges in the foam and things like that. So you're just going around and softening everything ready. Okay, then just doing final checks, making sure everything looks and feels good. Great to run your hands over it. You'll be able to feel some of the lumps without actually seeing them, so just double checking everything is perfect. And that is it. Shaping is complete. So now you can see everything's softened. You can actually see the tail there where you've got that slight roll over into the tail. We've got our 60-40 rails, so more taken off the deck, just tucking underneath onto the underside. You can see how that sort of blends down off the deck now. Got that slightly softened tail, but good for a hard edge. The concaves. So now the board is completely shaped. The next step is to fit the fin plugs. So what I do is, you can see the plans on the board there, so you can go and grab those plans, but I just mark out the fin layout onto the deck. I'm using a shaper's square here, but I've done it for a very long time with a builder's square and a ruler, so you don't actually need this shaping square. But what I'm doing is I'm squaring off the stringer, but it ends up being about 30 millimeters, you can check the plans, but about 30 millimeters from the edge of the rail. And then the toe angle, which is the fins pointing slightly towards the nose, the center of the nose, and you'll see that on the plans as well, is around about 6 to 6.5 millimeters, and I draw the line. So now I've got the two fins. So I'm doing a thruster setup here, even though I've got all of the dimensions for a quad setup or a 5-fin setup on the plans. I'm just sticking to a thruster for this board. So just measuring out from the stringer, making sure that they're centered from the stringer as well as the rail. So just in case your board ended up slightly out of symmetry. And then using the FCS jig, I set the router depth just slightly deeper than the fin plug, so it will sit just very slightly down. And then it's just a matter of really holding that perfectly in position and routing around that, taking that foam out. I'm not sure how you do this without the FCS jig. That shape is pretty hard to replicate without it, but I really like using the FCS fin systems, so it's pretty easy once you've got the jig. So then just following the same process on the other side, using a dummy fin with the plug just to make sure they all fit. When you're going through the stringer, it's a little more difficult because the timber is harder to route, and so you just sort of need to, it just takes a little bit longer here. You don't want to blow it out, particularly because the back of the tail there is really thin. So you just rub down lengthways on the stringer until you're slowly moving out some of that material before you try and actually go across the stringer, and that just helps just get it mostly out of the way before you try and go across grain on the wood. So the next step is to fit the fins. FCS, the angle is in the plug itself, so I always lay them out with the dummy fins here to make sure they're in the right side. Very easy to mix it up and have the wrong fin in the wrong side. So you put the fins in. This could be an old set of fins, but I've got this specialized dummy set, but they're honestly just plastic fins. And then I just prop it up so it's a little closer to level, so I'm not going to have any resin and stuff running around, but more importantly so that I can eye up the fins afterwards, and I know that the board is somewhat level, so my eye's sort of in tune with making sure that they're all on the same angle and everything's square and centered to the stringer. So then I just mix up some resin. This is about 40 grams of clear epoxy resin. Same resin we'll be using for the laminating. I use the same resin throughout this entire build. And then put some FCS powder in here. This adds a little bit of substance and strength to the resin we're going to be setting these fin plugs in with. The FCS powder is really just like a fiberglass dust basically, and it really helps just add that bit of strength. So just give that a really good mix for a couple of minutes, and then just with a small paintbrush, you want to paint in the holes of the plugs, so all the way around, and then also all over the plug itself. So there's little grooves in the plug itself, so you're looking for enough volume that the squeeze out is going to fill all of those grooves and give a really good adhesion, but not so much that it's going to be sort of running all over the board. Because the router depth is set perfectly, we just want a small amount on the underside as well, on the underside of the plug. So we don't want so much pull in there that it gets hard to squeeze it out if they're floating too much. So setting your router depth is really key there to make sure this is really easy. Then we just clean up any of the excess. We're going to be laminating our fiberglass directly on this, so you want to make sure there's no lumps or drips or anything left on the foam here, because that would create a lump in the fiberglass. Then just using the fin, you can change the angle and squeeze out if it's slightly high at the front, slightly at the back, if it's tilting one way or the other. So you just use your fin there to move the box around. Then once you're happy, it's a matter of just eyeing that up. You could also set a jig that shows the right angle from side to side, and you can also tape these in position. But I find if you've set the router depth properly here, that just stays perfectly in position like that. It's sort of a snug fit, so you can just work it to how you want it. You can see we've just got just underneath the foam there, and those plugs are fitted. Sighting it from the nose is really important, so that you make sure you've got the same angle on either side, and the center fin is exactly straight as well. Okay, so it's the next day. That's all set up now, and the fin resin has gone hard, so I've just brought it back inside for glassing. So you can crack those fins out, and you can see that's just below the flat side of the fin plug, but the mound in the center sits proud, so we'll be sanding that down as we sand the fiberglass. You can see the knifey rails here as well, so that's sort of 70-30. I like the knifey rails for kiting particularly, so you can really lean into that rail, and the concave through to the fins. Okay, so that's it. We are ready to start glassing. Shape is complete, fin plugs are fitted, and so in the next step we'll start fiberglass. Okay, so for fiberglassing, I'm going to start by creating a cut lap. I'm going to be using a color on the bottom lamination, and so cut laps are really key here to keep everything neat and keep the color not wrapped all around onto the deck. So I just marked out around about 40 to 50 millimeters, I think is a good design for a cut lap. For a strapless board that I'm going to be doing jumps on, adding that extra lap here and allowing the fiberglass to come around onto the deck, and the other way around as well. So when we do the deck lamination, wrapping it around onto the bottom of the board means that we'll end up with 18 ounces of fiberglass on the rails, which really adds so much strength to the board itself. So really key actually for strapless riding, I find. So wrapping the tape around for the cut lap, and then I just get some paper and just go over the whole board and really protect all of the foam that's not going to be part of this lamination, because I find that even if I'm trying to keep it neat, I'll end up accidentally touching that foam with some resin and adding some color there accidentally. So I just go around and cover everything up and tape it down. So I just press all of that down, and that keeps a really nice sharp edge for where we're going to cut the cut lap. So now you can see how that looks, just that even line all the way around the deck. So what I like to do for the fins is cut a sort of 1/4 patch for over the tail. So what you can do, we want to reinforce the fin boxes. It's a classic area for where most of my boards get damaged. You hit a rock or you hit something and it busts out one of the fin boxes. So you can just cut 3 ovals and lay them over the fins, but this is another way to do it and adds extra strength to the tail. So I just cut a patch that goes to in front of the front fins, cut a slight angle there so it's a bit of a V, and so you're distributing some of that load. And this also adds a bit of strength all around the tail for where your back foot loads. I find doing jumps, another area that fails is the load off the back foot when you're about to do a jump actually wears down on the tail, and so this extra patch helps with that as well. So it reinforces the fin boxes and also creates some strength for that load that you're doing with the back foot. Now I did forget to put the FCS stickers on, really important. So you put the sticker on here to make sure the resin's not going into the FCS fin box while you're laminating. So with the stickers on, I'm laying the patch back in position, and you'll just note that I've cut very closely all around the rail shape there. So the next step I'd like to do is cut a slot right above the fin box itself. This allows that fiberglass to spread over the mound that the fin has, that the fin box has. Otherwise, I find I get a lot of air bubbles all around the fin box. So this was a great tip given to me by a shaper that just allows that fiberglass to really rest down onto the blank. Next step, pull in a full length piece of 6-ounce fiberglass. This is all 6 ounce. I'm doing the whole thing in 6-ounce fiberglass. And then I cut, just using my thumb as a guide, going around all the way around the rail. I cut about an 80mm lap here. So this will be enough to wrap all the way around and up onto the masking tape so that we're getting complete coverage on that cut lap. You want to cut this a bit oversized. You don't want it way too big, but a bit oversized so that we're going to make sure that we get fiberglass all the way to the cut lap, all the way around. Then I just trim the same slot with the scissors again over the fin box. That'll allow this layer to also settle down. Once I've done that, I'll do some relief cuts around the tail and the nose. A classic here is sort of one on each corner and one on the stringer. And at the nose, I do one sort of on the stringer and on each corner, but also I'd cut a little V or a little wedge over the stringer. So you cut a wedge on the stringer and 2 flaps on either side, and this relief cut will allow you to stretch the fiberglass all the way around these curves. So it will fold the 2 rails and then the 2 flaps and then the wedge over the nose. I'm just cutting some, if there's way too much excess, it can get a little hard to wrap, so just cutting some of the excess off. Okay, so the next step is to mix up some resin. So I'm using clear epoxy resin. This is Entropy resins, but you can use any resin system you want. And I'm going to be using color tint. So of course you could just use clear, but I'm going to be tinting this. And the concept here is to sort of mix up some gray and some white, and then make a sort of clouded look, and I'm going to do a bit of a green highlight. So what I found with tint is this is artwork, not my strength. So I basically just do what I can and see how it works out. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing up around about 1 liter of resin, which is more resin than you would need. So 500 grams in each cup, 2 cups, and I'm mixing 1 in white and 1 in gray. So I start by adding the color tint to part A, and then once I've sort of blended that together, I'll add some hardener. And the reason I'm having the 2 different pots is so that I can pour them simultaneously and swirl it around to create this kind of smoke look. You want to combine this really well, and I'm using more resin than I need because when you're doing color, you don't want to have to overwork the resin, which will blend a lot of the colors together while you're working with the squeegee. So if you mix up more resin than you need, then you can be sort of splash it around everywhere and make sure it's just dripping over the edges, and you get that better color definition. So I'm mixing really thoroughly here, and I just add a little bit of gray to the white so that it's not bright white. So I've got a very light white now and that darker gray. A very, very light gray now and the darker gray as well. Then to add a slight highlight, what I like to do is just take a bit of the highlight color, in this case I'm going to be using green, and you just drizzle it on the top of the resin without really mixing it in. So a bit of a drizzle on the top and about 1 swirl with the stick just gives that kind of highlight swirl through the resin, and you just leave it like that. I'm also going to do the same thing with a bit of black into the gray pot as well. So I've got a bit of a gray, bit of a dark black highlight as well. So then, ready to pour it onto the blank, I just take both pots and just pour it all around. Then spread it with the squeegee, not mixing it too much here, just letting it sort of set into that foam. Where it hits the foam, it tends to stain it that way. So once it's sort of soaked in for a second, like it has now, then a lot of that color will stay the same in that fiberglass and in that foam underneath. Once I've fully saturated all around on the board, I want to let that soak for a couple of minutes, and so at that point I just leave that really heavily saturated on the board and I start working on the all around the rail flaps. So I'm taking a small piece of cardboard in one hand and the squeegee in the other hand, and just working all the way around to fully saturate the fiberglass that is hanging down. You want to make sure that looks clear, or in this case grey, fully saturated, so we have enough resin. Once I've done that, enough time has passed that I start working some of the excess out to the rails. So with medium pressure on the squeegee here, or even light pressure at this point, just slowly moving that resin out to the rails so it starts running down those flaps as well. And then once I'm happy with that, I'll start wrapping it under. So with the squeegee, you're sort of adding pressure up and in and stretching that fiberglass around the rail, pushing it up against the deck of the board, all the way onto that masking tape that we've got for our cut lap. So you really want to have that well stuck all the way around, no air bubbles, nicely stretched, and you're looking for squeeze out of the resin there so you don't have these shiny patches. You're kind of adding a little bit of pressure. You don't want to push it off the stands, of course, but really adding that pressure up of a saturated cloth so that it's sticking to that foam underneath. Once I've gone all the way around the rails on the sides, then I do the tail and the nose and fold those relief cuts underneath. So I'm just double checking that everything has adhered underneath, and then at this point it's time to remove any of the excess resin. So I go over the deck again now with medium pressure, and I'm looking to take any pooling resin out at this point. Don't want to undersaturate it, and you don't want to drag too much of the resin off, but if you're dragging the squeegee and there's little buildup on the squeegee, then that means you're still probably slightly over saturated. So you're just taking any of that excess off, and I'm just looking at where the fin boxes are and making sure that I have lots of saturation around those fin boxes so that it's soaked right in, and we're going to get that no air bubbles around where the fin box is. You don't want to overwork it here, and it's not the end of the world if you leave a little too much resin in there, but you're looking for that texture of the fiberglass without it looking dry and without any pull-in shiny spots. Once I'm happy that I've moved all of that resin off the bottom of the board, I do the same thing all the way around the rails. So I'll go around the rails again and just removing the excess. Anything that's coming off onto the squeegee there, just putting it back in the bucket, going all the way around and getting any excess off now. You'll find that as you've moved it all off the bottom of the board, you'll still see some resin that's running and dripping around the rails, so you're just trying to get rid of all of that. So then just going around making sure that all around the corners is pulled up tight. You can start to see, hopefully in the camera here, the texture, and wrapped all the way underneath the rails, all onto the masking tape. You can sort of see the texture there in the fiberglass, so it kind of has that texture, no big pooling areas, but not too dry. Lots of saturation around where the fin boxes are, and those flaps there have been folded on top of each other, just making sure that that's pushed up flat. Of course, we'll sand that back smooth in a moment. And around the tail as well. Okay, and that is the bottom lamination done. So a few hours later, when the resin is starting to go hard but still slightly malleable and you can sort of still bend it, you come back and cut the cut lap. This is a lot easier than letting the resin fully go hard. You want it hard enough that you can flip the board over without it getting stuck to the stands, but soft enough you can still cut it with a razor blade. And so I just start by just getting a bit of the masking tape with one hand, and then using the razor blade, you run the razor blade along as you're pulling up with the tape, so it starts to slightly lift it as you're running that razor blade along. And I find this is a great way just to cut this cut lap now, and saves a lot of time with cutting and sanding if you were to let it fully set up. So the timing of this is reasonably important. What you're looking for is the resin is gone, it will have gone completely hard in the pot, and it's not sticky at all. It's for the most part hard, but if you grab a strand or something, you'll still be able to flex it. So once you've cut all of that off, we can flip the board back over and let it continue to cure. Okay, so it's the next day and the resin's gone hard, and so I just take it into the shaping bay again, and with the angle grinder and a sanding disc, this is 40 grit sandpaper, just carefully take off any burrs and any lumps that have occurred from the cut lap. So particularly around the nose and the tail where we have the folding of all of those laps, this, you just want to smoothen all this out for the top lamination that we're about to do. Very important that you don't sand through the fiberglass here, particularly with the color, it'll be so noticeable, and very important you don't hit the foam. So just holding the sandpaper on the perfect angle there as you're going around. I then just use a sanding block just to clean that up again, make it nice and smooth. All we're really trying to do here is have a nice clean edge ready for where we're going to lay our clear lamination in a moment, but making sure that there's no lumps, no bumps, and also no shiny patches. So if you do have too much resin or drips of resin, this is a great time just to clean those up as well and make sure everything is ready. Now, one other thing that I do that most people don't do is I start doing a pre-sand over my fin boxes. So I'm using that same coarse sanding paper here and starting to knock the mound off, particularly where we had that, where we'd cut the fiberglass to let it sit down over the fin boxes. So it's quite rough there. And so I just start by pre-sanding this so that when we do our next cut lap, which is going to lap over those side fins particularly, I just find that helps with the sanding in later stages. So just make sure you get all the dust off here. We're going to be laminating to this board, so after this sanding, making sure there's no dust left on the board. Alright, so now all the laps are smoothed off, any of those burrs are clean, and we're ready for the top lamination. So a bit of a close-up here of just sanding down over the fin boxes, just starting to hit the plastic with the fin box there, but leaving it to make sure I'm not going to get resin in the fin box itself, but this makes it a lot smoother for the cut lap of the deck lamination. Alright, so for the deck lamination, we're going to do the same process where we tape up the cut lap on the underside of the board here. So the deck lamination, we're going to be doing 2 full layers of 6 ounce. So I've pulled the first layer of 6 ounce and using my thumb again, going all the way around and leaving that cut lap. What I do like to do sometimes is make this first layer a little bit smaller, so you can see I'm keeping it around about 30 millimeters down off the rail, and that means that the second lamination will blend out and we won't have that really double thick hard edge on the cut lap, but you could just do the same size for both. So then pulling the second sheet of 6 ounce fiberglass, and this time leaving that 80 millimeter lap, making sure that we're going to hit all the way to the masking tape. So we'll do relief cuts again for the nose and tail, but what I like to do is just offset it from what we did on the underside so we don't have the same weak point in the fiberglass. So this time I'm going to cut slightly wider on the nose and then on either side of the stringer, but a wider sort of shape here so that, again, we're not duplicating that weak point in the fiberglass. And if it wasn't clear for the bottom lamination, the way we do it here is start by folding the 2 flaps on either side, and then you can see it all sort of folds neatly as you stretch it underneath. And just looking at that, with that, I could see that it was going to bunch up a little bit with the fiberglass there. So I've added one more cut right on the stringer there. So we come around from the rails, tucking them, getting closer to the nose there, and you can see everything pulls up nice and tight there. Particularly when it's wet with resin, you can stretch that fiberglass underneath. And at the tail, doing the same thing with some relief cuts, this time going slightly on either side of the sort of rounded square tail there. So we'll have a straight flap right at the tail itself, and then we'll pull these 2 wedges right around that sharp corner of the tail. So again, we pull the rails, we pull the tail, and then that wedge at the end. And it's time to mix up some more epoxy resin. So for the deck lamination, I'm just going to be using clear epoxy resin, no color at all, and I'm mixing 750 grams of resin. So normally when you have more cloth, you need more resin. So we mixed a liter for the bottom that had sort of 1 1/4 lamination, and only 750 grams for this double lamination. And that's mainly just because I was mixing the color on the underside, so I wanted extra resin. But 750 grams is plenty for a board of this size with the 2 layers of 6 ounce cloth. And then same process as before, saturate out the cloth, really let all of this soak through. So I really oversaturate right now, lots of resin, allowing it to soak through the fiberglass into the epoxy, and then using my piece of cardboard, I'll just start by wetting out all of the rails. So running an extra bead there around, and then just working that down onto all of the fiberglass, making sure it turns clear and that we're getting that full saturation. And then by the time I've worked all the way around, that's normally enough time that the fiberglass has had enough time to soak, and I'm ready to start moving some of that excess out of the deck. So angled squeegee here, moving the excess off to the rail, bring it down onto the rail, light pressure on the rail there, just sort of working it down onto the flaps there. And then we can roll the fiberglass here, starting in the center of the board, moving towards the nose and the tail. Again, pressure, sort of stretching that fiberglass all the way around, make sure it's sticking underneath and nice and tight on the rail itself. So adding that pressure up and in. I like to do both sides of the boards first, leaving the nose and tail to last, and then carefully just folding the tail and nose up. Then just going around, making sure there's no lumps or folds. That can be classic underneath those rails, is there's some folds of fiberglass, so just really working that nice and flat. And then finally just removing any of the excess out of the fiberglass. Removing any of the excess, you can see as it starts to come off the squeegee, if you've got any of those beads on the squeegee, just trying to get it to a point that we can see that texture in the light. We don't have any shiny patches. There's no excess coming off on the squeegee, but it's not too dry. And you can see some of that shiny around the rail, so just removing that around and pushing it up onto the underside. Just like we did on the bottom, but just a bit of a close-up here. Better shapers than me would do this really quickly and could probably do it in a single pass, but for me, I prefer to go round and round a couple of times and just make sure I'm getting all of those bubbles out, making sure I'm getting all of the shiny patches, any drips, making sure everything's stuck really well. And often I'll even come back 20 minutes afterwards and make sure everything is still stuck in position. And there we have it. The deck lamination is now done. So we can let that set up until it's stiff enough to cut the cut lap. So just like we did on the bottom side, I've just let this set up now until it's hard enough to cut the cut lap. Grab a piece of tape and cut all the way around. One thing you just want to pay attention to when you're cutting the cut lap on the second lamination here is that we're not cutting through the fiberglass. So just making sure not too much pressure with the razor blade there, that we're not going to cut that bottom lamination. And then we can let that cure completely. And the next day we are ready to clean up that cut lap again. So same deal, just getting rid of any of the burrs, highs, bumps, everything like that. Any masking tape that might be still stuck under the lamination, and using the grinder again with the coarse sandpaper, just going around and cleaning all that up. You want to blend this in slightly because all we're going to be doing now is the hot coat or the filler coat of resin. So we're not going to be adding too much thickness that we're going to be able to sand down at a later stage. So I'm using the sander to also blend in the cut lap into the bottom lamination without hitting that bottom lamination though, because you don't want to burn through the fiberglass while you're sanding this cut lap. You also don't want to burn through the cut lap itself either. So really not over sanding here. Sanding is a area that can be hard when you're learning to shape. It's the temptation is to over sand to try and make it as smooth as possible, or to under sand. Some people don't give it enough time, so you want to give it enough time that the job looks perfect and everything is smooth, but not so much sanding that you end up going through the fiberglass and ruining the job. And now we're ready for the filler coat. So this is sometimes referred to as a hot coat. However, I'm using the same resin system, so this is really just a filler coat. There's no fast setting or fast curing resin that I'm using. So I start by just masking a drip edge all the way around the underside of the rail, or about halfway on the rail but a little bit lower. And I find if I do the deck first, this works really well for setting the hard edge of the tail in the next hot coat. So I'm taping all the way around. all this is doing is allowing the resin to drip off the bottom of the board and not stick to the surface tension and wrap around. So I've mixed up 450 grams of the same clear resin, and I just start by pouring it on the deck. Using a paintbrush, a disposable paintbrush, just really spreading it around, making sure everything gets painted. And the way that I like to do it is just make sure everything looks wet and everything has been touched with the resin, and then just using 45-degree angle strokes with the brush in both directions just to smooth out any lumps. Light pressure on the brush here, just making everything look flat, and then going nose to tail and then all the way around the rail. We don't want any drips. We want a good coat of resin here. You don't want it to be too thin, but you want to make sure that everything is flat, and then just lengths, nose to tail, no pressure there on the brush at all, just smoothing everything out, and then we just let that settle and go flat. So before the resin goes really hard, similar to how we did the cut lap, it's a good idea to come back and pull the masking tape off before all of the drips actually go rock hard and the masking tape gets stuck under them. So I just come back again, similar to how we did the cut lap, when the resin's stiff enough that I can turn the board over, but soft enough that I can pull the masking tape off. Okay, so it's the next day and we're ready to do the hot coat on the bottom. And so you just want to match up that exact line that you had the last layer of resin with the masking tape on the other side. So we're creating the drip edge again, but so that the resin is going to meet. And we do that for all the way around the rails and around the nose. So once we get to a little bit in front of the fins, I like to bring the tape up to a bit on above the bottom of the board so that the resin will dam there and we can actually have it pull. And then we'll use the sander to create the hard edge. So going all the way around the tail with that masking tape just slightly proud. One of the reasons that I like to do the deck first like we did was so that a lot of the resin has kind of leaches underneath that masking tape. So we've already got a bit of resin all the way around that rail. It's also a reason why on the previous step I like to have the masking tape lower so we're getting most of the rail done. So now you can see that what we've got is that slight proud masking tape that creates that dam all the way around, and you can even see some of that resin that is leached underneath, which is really great for helping build this hard edge. And it goes to just in front of the fins there. So next I've mixed up another 450 grams of resin, and in this case you just want to make sure that the board is sitting kind of level towards the tail. If you have the tail sloped too far down, it'll pull aggressively right at the back of the tail, but you want the resin to distribute kind of evenly. So I normally prop up the tail to make sure that it's looking somewhat level, and the resin will pull nicely from the tail to the fins. Then same deal, I just dump all of the resin on there and start spreading it around with the disposable brush. So I'm painting it right up into the tape. Another thing I should mention is you've really got to make sure that tape is pressed hard up against the fiberglass, so running your finger all around the tape, because if there's any holes or cracks in that tape, the pooling of the resin will actually drain out and you won't get the hard edge and you'll get a lot of resin falling down. So same process again, 45-degree strokes to get the resin even from side to side, and then all the way around the rails, taking any drips, and then nose to tail lengths to get the resin nice and flat. Okay, so now it's the next day. I pulled the tape again when it was sort of semi-set. So you can see that build up around the hard edge now. It's perfect for sanding around the tail. Okay, so now with the resin set, it's time to start fitting the leash plug. And I set it around about 50 millimeters from the tail, but you can go a little bit closer. And I'm going to set this right in the stringer. It makes it really strong. You could go on either side. With a swallowtail, I'll always go to the side. But for this rounded squash tail, I put the leash plug right into the stringer. Makes it solid as anything. So I've just got a very simple FCS fin plug jig there, where I've just drilled a hole through that plastic with a bit of tolerance on either side, so about 2 millimeters all the way around, and that just allows for the resin to go all the way around the fin plug there. I then take the flush trim router bit and set it to the depth that it will just leave the fin plug slightly proud. So I'm going to sand the top off the plug Really important that you don't want the fin plug too low, because then it ends up with this resin over the top of it. So you want it just slightly up, and then we'll sand it off. These fin plugs do have a slight mound on the top, and you could put a fiberglass patch over the top of them. However, I typically don't. So the first step is I just take a 12.5mm drill bit and drill down slightly at the center of the fin plug, and that's going to allow that router bit to rest in there on top of the jig. So very important you don't drill through here, of course, but just gently drilling down to allow that router bit in. And then holding the jig in place, you can route that around. Through the stringer can be a little bit hard, but just slowly working around there until you've got all the way around the edges. And then I just like to dry fit it, make sure it's going to fit. You can see it's slightly proud on the fiberglass there, so we don't need to float it with any resin or anything like that. And we're ready to set it in. So just mixing up 15 grams of resin here, small batch. Also adding some fiberglass powder for strength. And in this case, I'm going to add a very slight amount of white pigment as well. So this creates more of a toothpaste consistency, so that it's a little stiffer. So the fiberglass powder, sorry, creates the toothpaste consistency. So it just sort of squeezes out a little bit better and adds a bit of strength. And the white just adds that white ring around the plug, so it just looks a little neater, although you don't really need the tint. You can just use clear. So I just push that down, let it all squeeze out, clean up the excess. One thing I've found is often you'll get these bubbles coming up around the plug here. So you want to have enough excess that as those bubbles come up and resin can drop down and fill those cavities, because it's kind of seeping into the cavities of the foam. So that's something I've learned in the past. And then you can just add a little bit of masking tape there to hold it in position. Okay, so the next day the resin's gone hard, and just using the 40 grit sandpaper just to clean that up. Don't want to over sand here. I'm saying it again, really important that you don't sand through any of your layers of fiberglass, because you can ruin your entire board right now. You have to do big patches, and it's very easy to do. So just blending it off, smoothing it off without over sanding. Then I move to the random orbital. This has got an 80 grit sanding pad on it. And back to the 40 grit on the angle grinder around all of that buildup of the resin from the hard edge. So just taking that down to close, so that I'm almost shaping that resin at this point, just making sure that it's going around my double concave and the V shape and everything looks good. Then using the random orbital, this is a high spinning random orbital. A polisher sander would do the same thing. And with that 80 to 100 grit sandpaper and also a soft back, it's not fully soft, but a rubber backing on the sandpaper, so it goes around the curves a little bit better and doesn't dig in. And just going over it once, again, not over sanding it. Notorious area is on the rails to over sand and burn through, so barely touching the rails, but just getting any lumps and bumps and any of the highs of resin. I find that I don't sand with a power sander until everything looks dull. You'll still see some shiny patches on the lows of any grooves and any indentations, and then I hand sand all of that out. If I try and power sand all the way till the entire thing looks dull, then I've sanded too far typically. You definitely don't want to sand anywhere you see any texture. If you start to see weave coming through, stop sanding that area immediately and only do it by hand after that point. An exception to that is kind of around where the fin boxes are. You are definitely going to hit weave, because of course you have to expose the fin boxes, and around the tail where you've had that build up and the cut lapse, you might hit a little bit of weave, but again, you're paying close attention to it. So around the tail, you are kind of shaping it out and just looking at how the water is going to flow over that. Because we've got that build up of resin, it is easy to sort of leave this kicker at the tail accidentally. So you want to sight along the board there and make sure that, and just visualize how that water is going to be flowing off the tail there, and make sure everything's carved out nicely. So back on the 40 grit with the angle grinder, just taking out some of the excess around the fin boxes and slowly starting to expose them. And then back on the random orbital to blend and make sure I haven't created any divots and everything's smooth. Now that I'm happy that I've done everything with the 80 grit, I'll go with the actual random orbital and just go with some 120 grit. And you can see what I want to do is soften around the rail but not at the tail. So I'm holding the random orbital on about that 10 degree or 15 degree angle that's creating that hard edge, and that's the way that we shaped it as well. And then blending that up onto the surface in front of the fins but leaving that hard edge around the tail. And of course then just sanding all around the nose and the rails, making everything smooth. And then once I'm happy that everything is looking good with the random orbital, I can move to hand sanding. So with a soft block and some 120 grit sandpaper, just going over the entire board now by hand. The block is just foam, so you can use the pressure of your hand to mold it around the rail shape. So I've just taken off the sticker and just scraping out any of the layer that's still over the fin boxer there and just sanding that down. And then all around the rails. At this point, you want everything to feel smooth. Again, we're just trying to sand. The goal here is to sand the resin and not go through into the fiberglass. It's a fine line for sure, so it can be difficult. So you're trying to smooth it out without going too far. Once I'm happy with the 120, I move to 220. This is just dry sandpaper and go all the way around, just basically removing the scratches of the 120 at this point. And now it's time to move to wet and dry. So 320 grit wet and dry sandpaper with water with a bit of dish soap in it. And I go all the way around this just by hand, and I like to go around it a few times. So over every surface, go all the way around the board, and then I start again like I haven't done it yet, and I go over every surface again, and I find that that really makes sure that I'm hitting everything. And this wet and dry takes a board that looks kind of rough sanded, and it creates this slurry as you're working it with the water and the dish soap, and it really smooths that fiberglass out and gives it that satin look. And once I've been over it a couple of times with the 320, I just take it out, give it a rinse off with the hose, a wipe down with a towel, and the board's ready to ride. This is the standard that I finish most of my boards to. I just finish it with the wet and dry 320. However, in this case, I'm going to hit it with some floor sealer Rejuvenate that I've been recommended, and I've been using it on a couple of my projects. It's more of a scratch remover. It seals any of that little exposed weave that I might have hit, and it's really easy to apply. So all I do is wipe it around with a rag, leave it 10 minutes, repeat the process, 10 minutes, let it dry, and then just hit it with a Scotch-Brite, and it just brings it up to that nice shine. Like I said, it gives that a little bit of waterproofing for any exposed weave, and a really simple way to finish it. And that is it. The board is ready to ride. So I like to just throw a couple of traction pads on it. I like riding my boards with traction pads for freestyle and for wave riding. Particularly the sanded EVA traction pads I find really helpful and just so easy and reliable underfoot, particularly for landing tricks. You always know what you're going to get when your foot hits that deck pad, whereas wax, although I find wax is kind of easier in some cases, it's a bit unreliable when it gets hot or slippery or sandy, and so I've really moved to traction pads for all of my boards. So I just deck it out with the traction pads, a couple of stickers, and ready to hit the water. Okay, and that is it for this video. So hopefully you found a few tips there if you plan on making a strapless board for yourself or even a surfboard. Like I said, very similar processes always that I'm using throughout all of my boards. The only thing that really varies is the fiberglass layup. More fiberglass if I want it to be heavier and stronger, and less if I want it to be lighter and better for jumps, and surfing is also a little bit lighter glassing than my kiteboards as well. But other than that, it's pretty much identical for all the boards that I'm making. So like I said, hopefully there's some takeaways there. If you're going to make your board for yourself, make sure you let me know. Send us an email with the boards you're making, any questions you might have. I've only been riding this freestyle so far. We haven't had any waves since I finished this board. So my next step is to wait for some swell, get out there and ride some waves, and then I'm going to make a then I'm going to make a video about how it rides and how it performs both for freestyle and for wave riding. So like I said, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.